I never imagined I'd become the antagonist in someone else's power trip, but that's exactly what happened when Margaret Hayes took over as president of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association, HOA. For context, I'm Ethan Carter, a small business owner who runs a successful digital marketing agency. 3 years ago, I decided to diversify my investments and purchased Willow Creek Plaza, a modest shopping center just outside our neighborhood. It was a smart financial move, and the convenience of being able to walk to work was an added bonus. I live in one of the nearby residential neighborhoods under the Willow Creek HOA's jurisdiction, but my commercial property is entirely separated, so I thought. The trouble began when I decided to update the signage for my office. It wasn't anything flashy, just a clean, professional sign with my company logo and name, Carter Digital Solutions. I filed all the necessary permits with the city and scheduled the installation for a Tuesday morning. Little did I know, this simple act would turn me into public enemy number one in Margaret Hayes' eyes. I was in the middle of a client meeting when my phone started buzzing incessantly. 6 missed calls, all from the same unknown number. When I finally stepped out to answer, I heard Margaret's voice, sweet as honey but laced with condescension. "Mr. Carter, this is Margaret Hayes, president of the Willow Creek HOA. I'm standing outside your establishment, and there seems to be a serious violation in progress. The workers you've hired are attempting to install signage that hasn't been approved by the Architectural Review Committee. I've already asked them to stop work immediately." I took a deep breath before responding. "Margaret, I appreciate your vigilance, but Willow Creek Plaza isn't part of the residential HOA. It's commercially zoned property. I've already obtained all the necessary permits from the city." There was a momentary silence on the other end of the line. "Well, that's where you're mistaken," she replied with an audible smirk. "The plaza's entrance connects to Willow Creek Drive, which means any external modifications viable from our community roads fall under our jurisdiction. It's in Section 7, Paragraph 3 of the bylaws." I wanted to argue, but I had clients waiting. "Look, I'll come by in an hour once my meeting wraps up. Please don't interfere with the workers in the meantime. They're just doing their job." "I'm afraid I can't allow the work to continue," Margaret stated firmly. "As HOA president, it's my responsibility to maintain the aesthetic integrity of our community. Your sign is much too modern for the traditional look we've cultivated here in Willow Creek. The workers have already agreed to postpone installation until proper approval is obtained." I ended the call and apologized to my clients for the interruption. The meeting ran longer than expected, and by the time I arrived at my office, the signage crew was packing up their tools. The foreman approached me with an apologetic look. "Sorry, Mr. Carter. That lady said she'd call the police if we didn't stop. She showed us some official-looking document and took photos of our truck and license plate. We didn't want any trouble." I assured him it wasn't his fault and rescheduled the installation for the following week. Then I headed to my office to review the HOA bylaws. As I suspected, Margaret was overreaching her authority. The commercial property was completely separate from the residential area, despite sharing the name Willow Creek. I printed out the relevant documents, including my property deed and the city permits, to clear things up with Margaret directly. The next morning, I stopped by Margaret's house on my way to work. She answered the door in a crisp white blouse and perfectly pressed khaki pants, a clipboard already in hand, as if she'd been expecting complaints all morning. "Good morning, Margaret. I brought some documentation that should clear up yesterday's misunderstanding," I said politely, extending the folder toward her. She didn't take it. Instead, she gave me a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "There's no misunderstanding, Mr. Carter. The Architectural Review Committee met for an emergency session last night and formally denied your signage application. I've already emailed the decision to you." I checked my phone, and, sure enough, there was an email sent at 11:37 p.m. from the Willow Creek HOA account. "Margaret, you know as well as I do that Willow Creek Plaza isn't under HOA jurisdiction. The committee has no authority to approve or deny anything related to my property." She crossed her arms, her posture stiffening. "Perhaps you should have read the fine print before purchasing property adjacent to a covenant-controlled community. Our bylaws clearly state that all businesses within a quarter-mile radius of Willow Creek must maintain aesthetic consistency with neighborhood standards. Your proposed sign, with its blue LED backlighting and contemporary font, violates those standards. This was complete nonsense, but arguing with Margaret when she was in full HOA president mode was like trying to reason with a brick wall. I'll have my attorney re-VYEW this and get back to you, I said calmly, turning to leave. You do that, she called after me. And while you're at it, you might want to address the parking lot restriping you did last summer without approval, and those unapproved planters outside your office door. The fines have been accruing for quite some time. I spent the rest of the day consulting with my lawyer, who confirmed what I already knew. Margaret was completely out of bounds. The HOA had no jurisdiction over commercially zoned property outside the residential development. We drafted a polite but firm letter explaining the legal boundaries and requesting that the HOA cease and desist from interfering with my business operations. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. 3 days later, I arrived at work to find my partially installed sign had been removed overnight, not just taken down, but completely gone. In its place was a violation notice printed on official Willow Creek HOA letterhead, laminated and attached to the wall. The notice cited unapproved signage and failure to comply with architectural guidelines, along with a fine of due law $500. I was Lee VYD, but determined to remain professional. I called the signage company, who confirmed they hadn't removed anything. Then I checked our security cameras. The footage showed Margaret herself, accompanied by 2 men with a ladder and tools, Ari VYing at approximately 10:30 p.m., and Remo VYing my sign. They loaded it into the back of an SUV and drove away. This wasn't just HOA overreach, Anna Maria, it was trespassing and theft. I called the non-emergency police line to file a report, careful to remain factual and unemotional during the conversation. An officer came by that afternoon to take my statement and re-VYEW the security footage. We've had issues with this HOA before, the officer said with a sigh after watching the VYDeo. But this crosses a line into criminal behavior, or would you like to press charges? I hesitated. As satisfying as it might be to see Margaret in legal trouble, I prefer to resolve this without escalating to that level. Not yet. Let me try to handle this directly first. The officer nodded and VY'd me with a case number. Call us if anything else happens, or if you change your mind about pressing charges. I decided to attend that evening's HOA meeting, which was conveniently listed on the community bulletin board as an open session to discuss recent aesthetic violations and enforcement actions. When I walked into the community center meeting room, the casual conversations immediately hushed. Margaret, sitting at the center of a folding table at the front of the room, straightened her posture and narrowed her eyes. "Mr. Carter," she acknowledged with a cold smile. "We weren't expecting you this evening, but VY-siders are welcome to observe. You'll have an opportunity to address the board during the public comment section at the end of our agenda. Actually, Margaret, I'm here to address the removal of property from my business premises last night," I said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I have security footage showing you and 2 others taking down my sign without permission, which constitutes theft and trespassing. I've already filed a police report." Margaret's face flushed, but she quickly regained her composure. "The HOA was simply enforcing our bylaws after you blatantly ignored our denial of your signage application. As stated in Section 12 of our covenants, the board has the right to remove non-compliant installations after proper notification, which you received." I placed my folder on the table and opened it deliberately. I have here the property records showing that Willow Creek Plaza is not part of the residential HOA. I also have the police report number, the security footage, and a letter from my attorney explaining that the HOA has no legal jurisdiction over my commercially zoned property. Several board members exchanged concerned glances. One of them, a man in his 60s whom I recognized as a retired attorney, leaned over to whisper something to Margaret. She brushed him off with an impatient gesture. "Mr. Carter, if you have concerns about HOA actions, There's a formal grievance process outlined in our bylaws, she said dismissively. Now, if you'll excuse us, we need to proceed with our agenda. I remained standing. I also have here a letter from the City Planning Department, dated today, confirming that the Willow Creek Homeowners Association has no jurisdiction over Willow Creek Plaza or any other commercial property in the area. Additionally, I have an estimate for the cost of the Sign Your Team damage during its unauthorized removal, which comes to due $4,500. Margaret's face was now transitioning from flushed to alarmingly red. We didn't damage anything. Your sign wasn't up to code in the first place. Oh, and there's one more thing you should probably know, I continued calmly. I don't just own the office where my business is located. I own the entire Willow Creek Plaza property, all 6 acres, including the building where we're HOA-ing this meeting right now. The room went completely silent. Margaret's mouth opened and closed several times without producing any sound. This community center is leased to the neighborhood at a nominal fee because I believe in supporting the community where I live. But that lease agreement specifically prohibits using these premises for active VY ties that target or harass the landlord or any tenants of Willow Creek Plaza. The retired attorney cleared his throat. Margaret, I think we should take a brief recess to discuss this matter privately. Margaret ignored him, her eyes locked on mine. You're bluffing. The community center is owned by the HOA. I slid another document across the table. Property deed, dated 3 years ago. You can verify it with the county clerk's office. Now, about that Sign Your Team removed and damaged. The retired attorney stood up. I move that we immediately adjourn this meeting and reconvene with legal counsel present. All in favor? Every hand except Margaret shot up. Motion carried. Another board member said quickly. Meeting adjourned. As people began gathering their things, I approached the board table. I'll expect the return of my sign or payment for damages within 48 hours. After that, I'll proceed with pressing criminal charges and filing a CIVYL lawsuit, naming both the HOA and the Indy VY duels involved personally. Margaret remained seated, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the table. You can't just come in here and threaten us. This community has standards. We have rules. You think you can do whatever you want just because you own a few buildings? I think I can prevent people from stealing and damaging my property, I replied. And I think the police and the courts will agree with me. The next day, I received a call from the retired attorney, who introduced himself as Richard Thompson, the HOA's VYC president. Mr. Carter, on behalf of the board, I want to apologize for yesterday's unpleasantness. We've re-VYEU'd the documentation you pro-VY dead, and it's clear there's been a misunderstanding about jurisdictional boundaries. That's a diplomatic way of putting it, I said. Yes, well, he continued, sounding uncomfortable. We'd like to arrange for the immediate return of your sign, along with compensation for any damages incurred. Would it be possible to meet this afternoon to discuss the matter? We arranged to meet at my office at 3 o'clock. To my surprise, Richard arrived with 3 other board members, but no Margaret. They returned what remained of my sign, which had been bent and scratched during the removal process, and presented a check covering the full replacement cost. We want to assure you that the actions taken were not authorized by the full board, Richard explained. Margaret acted unilaterally, exceeding her authority. We've scheduled an emergency meeting tonight to address the situation. I accepted their apology and the check. I appreciate you handling this professionally. If this resolves the matter, I see no need to pursue legal action further. Richard looked relieved, but still troubled. There's one more thing, Mr. Carter. The community center lease, you mentioned certain terms. As long as the HOA returns to respecting property boundaries, both mine and others, I have no intention of altering our lease arrangement, I assured him. I value being part of this community. The following morning, I received an official email from the Willow Creek HOA board. It contained the minutes from their emergency meeting, along with a formal notice that Margaret Hayes had been removed from her position as president due to actions exceeding authority and exposing the association to significant legal liability. Richard Thompson had been appointed interim president until the next scheduled election. I thought that would be the end of the matter, but Margaret wasn't going down without a fight. That afternoon, as I was overseeing the installation of my new sign, a familiar SUV screeched into the parking lot. Margaret emerged, clutching a thick folder and marching toward me with fire in her eyes. "You think you've won, don't you?" she demanded, while VYing the folder in my face. "Well, I've been doing some research of my own. Your precious commercial property may not fall under HOA jurisdiction, but your house does. And guess what I found during my re-VYEW of your property?" She flipped open the folder to reveal photos of my home: an unapproved garden shed, a non-standard mailbox, and a fence exceeding height guidelines by 1.5 inches. "That's 3 violations with compounding penalties, dating back to when each was installed," she said triumphantly. "You should receive the formal violation notices by registered mail tomorrow. The initial fines total just under due law $35,000, but of course, they'll continue to accrue until the violations are remedied." I had to admire her thoroughness, even as I marveled at her dedication to pettiness. "Margaret, don't you think it's time to let this go?" I asked. "Rules are rules, Mr. Carter," she replied smugly. "You do realize the board voted to remove you as president last night, right? You don't have the authority to issue violations anymore." Her smug expression faltered for just a moment before she recovered. "I've already filed the paperwork. The violations are in the system, and I'm contesting the board's decision. They can't remove me without a proper hearing and a 2/3 majority vote of all homeowners." "Well, good luck with that," I said, turning back to the sign installers. "I need to focus on my business now." "This isn't over," Margaret declared, but I noticed her voice lacked some of its earlier con-VY tie-in. 2 days later, I received a different kind of notice from the HOA and VY Tatian to a special community meeting to address recent leadership concerns. When I arrived at the community center that evening, I was surprised to find the room packed. Richard nodded to me as I took a seat in the back. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," he began. "As many of you know, there have been some concerning developments regarding the enforcement of our community guidelines. The board voted 2 days ago to remove Margaret Hayes from her position as president, but there's been some question about proper procedure." At that moment, Margaret burst through the door, looking triumphant. "That's right. The bylaws clearly state that removal of an officer requires a community vote, not just a board decision. I'm still the rightful president of this association." Richard nodded calmly, "Which is why we've called this meeting. The board unanimously recommends the removal of Margaret Hayes as president due to her actions, which have exposed the association to legal liability and potential financial damages. We'll now open the floor for discussion before proceeding to a vote." What followed was an hour of revelations as neighbors took turns describing their own encounters with Margaret's overzealous enforcement. The woman who'd been fined for hot VYing wind chimes that were too audibly intrusive. The elderly gentleman who'd received violations for his holiday decorations being up 3 days past the allowed period while he was in the hospital. The family who'd been denied permission to install a wheelchair ramp for their child because it disrupted the community aesthetic. Margaret attempted to defend each action, citing specific bylaw pro-VY signs and property value concerns, but with each example, her support VY sibly eroded. When Richard finally called for a vote, the result was overwhelming. 97 fan tram in favor of removal, well beyond the 2/3 required by the bylaws. As Richard announced the results, all eyes turned to Margaret. Her face had gone from its usual flushed indignation to a pasty white. She stood frozen for a moment, clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield. This is a travesty," she finally sputtered. "I've dedicated years to maintaining the standards of this community. Without proper oversight, property values will plummet. You'll all regret this decision." No one responded. The silence in the room was deafening. Margaret gathered her belongings with trembling hands, dropping her prized clipboard in the process. Pages scattered across the floor, violation notices pre-filled, with only the addresses missing, ready to be deployed at the first sign of nonconformity. Several people moved to help collect them, giving Margaret an opportunity to see just how many of her neighbors had been in her crosshairs. She straightened her blouse, attempted to regain her composure, and headed for the door with as much dignity as she could muster. Just before exiting, she turned for one final proclamation. Mark my words, once this community starts to deteriorate without proper guidance, you'll be begging me to return. The door closed behind her with a definitive click. Through the window, I watched as Margaret stood alone in the parking lot, suddenly looking small and bewildered, as if she couldn't quite comprehend what had just happened. Her phone rang, and I saw her answer it, then physically recoil at whatever was being said. After a brief, animated conversation, she hung up and stood staring at her phone in apparent disbelief. Later, I learned from Richard that the call had been from Margaret's employer real estate firm specializing in high-end suburban properties. The managing partner had received numerous complaints about Margaret's HOA behavior, and its reflection on the company's reputation for community relations. She'd been placed on unpaid administrative leave, pending a review of her professional conduct. As I watched Margaret slump into her car, the gravy tie of her situation finally seeming to hit her, I almost felt a twinge of sympathy. Almost. She sat there for a long moment, hands gripping the steering wheel though the engine wasn't running. Her perfectly composed facade finally crumbled as tears streamed down her face. In the weeks that followed, the Willow Creek community began to heal. Richard Thompson, now officially elected as HOA president, worked to restore trust and transparency. The board review said several bylaws to prevent future abuses of power, and a new sense of cooperation emerged among residents. As for me, my new sign was finally installed without further interference. Business at Carter Digital Solutions continued to thrive, and I even found myself becoming more involved in the community not out of obligation, but because I genuinely wanted to contribute. Margaret Hayes, however, faded into obscurity. Her once commanding presence was replaced by a quiet, almost ghostly absence. Occasionally, I catch a glimpse of her driving through the neighborhood, her eyes fixed straight ahead, as if determined to avoid any reminder of her fall from grace. In the end, the Battle of Willow Creek wasn't just about a sign or a power struggle. It was about the importance of balance between rules and compassion, authority and accountability, tradition and progress. And as I walked through the plaza one evening, the soft glow of my new sign illuminating the path ahead, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride, not just for standing my ground, but for helping to pave the way for a brighter, more inclusive future in Willow Creek. If you were the one in this story, how would you react? Would you stand up and fight back, or accept the unreasonable pressure and control from the HOA? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video with more people. Your small action gives us the motivation to keep bringing you more intense and engaging stories. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.